So thank you so much, Askold, for joining me today. Your work with the Hub has just been absolutely remarkable, and it's been a joy to actually follow.
Good morning, Siswati, and thank you so very much for your interest in this and for your support for this project. I'm very grateful. We are all very grateful.
Oh, my pleasure. Well, without further ado, I'm just going to do a really brief introduction and why this is so important as well. So, founding editor of Arrowsmith Press, Askold Melnyczuk has taught at Boston University, Harvard, Bennington College, and currently teaches at University of Massachusetts, Boston. Is that correct?
That's right, exactly.
Fantastic. And in
Thank you.
honor of the Ukrainian novelist, essayist, and human rights activist Victoria Amelina, killed in July, the anthology Nothing Bad Has Ever Happened was released in September and a memorial was held. And this book has been wonderfully edited by Askold himself. So I've got to ask, in your opinion, what do you think made Victoria's work really shine?
Well, first of all, she was an accomplished novelist and a really fine essayist. And I had the privilege of publishing, I think, what were perhaps the first two essays that she wrote directly in English. And they were so very clear and very honest and moving in their mission. She took on as her task, both in her fiction and in her essays, a kind of uncovering of the histories of her now native city of Lviv, Ukraine, the western sort of part of Ukraine. And she, as I think many young writers of her generation, who grew up in the kind of the last throes of the Soviet system, they had not really known the history of their own country and their own region as kids, and they only began to discover it as after the fall of the Soviet Empire. The Russian, the Russian Empire, called the Soviet Empire, and that what they found as they peeled back the layers of time was startling and unsettling for them as they began to see that the city in which they lived had once had different names and had a different population living there, a
Mm,
large Jewish and Polish population in the case of Lviv. And Victoria was able to find a way to present this history and the complexity of it um, in a way that allowed her readers to not shy away from it. So that it was not kind of angrily confrontational; it was revelatory.
mm,
And similarly, in her essays, she was also able to find a voice that didn't want to rage at readers for not knowing their history, but wanted to bring them into key moments in the past so they could understand who they were now and how they had gotten there.
mm.
Um, so in both cases, in both genres, she was doing really kind of as morally important work that was aesthetically refined, is what I would say.
That's really wonderful, and it's wonderful to even capture that because it's just such a moving and such a it's not it's the total opposite of a stationary situation, isn't it? It's just
Yes.
constantly active. So in terms of the anthology itself that's come out, how did it come about, and how did you approach each writer as well?
Well, it came about out of a sense of personal necessity. Victoria was somebody who I'd met while she was living with her family here. I'm in Boston, and
Mm,
or just outside Boston, and she was living in Boston itself, in a neighborhood that I know well. And I've met her a couple of times for coffee. She had just returned from traveling to Tibet, and
wow.
we talked a little bit about that when we met, and we had some mutual friends in common in Ukraine in her native city of Lviv.
Mm,
And so we got together a couple of times, and then Arrowsmith Press had a little gathering for our various writers, including a Chimba um, Obi from Nigeria, and
mm,
Megan Marshall from Boston, who writes about the transcendentalists and
oh,
19th century feminists like Margaret Fuller, and a couple of other Harun Haruni, Iranian poet and
wow.
scholar at the Harvard School of Education. They were all sort of Arrowsmith columnists at different times. We had my wife and I had them over to our house, and we had a little kind of conversation about the meaning of home, since everybody happened to be from a different country and had found themselves in the U.S. And in that gathering happened about 2 weeks before COVID sent us all scurrying into our private recesses. But the conversation about home, I think, stayed with everybody there, so that Victoria became very quickly a part of the sort of improvisatory community that remained in touch with each other through the medium of the Arrowsmith Journal. When then later that 2 years later, after the war began, I wound up co-teaching a class with Victoria. We were teaching an online class in creative writing to Ukrainian students who
Mm.
were scattered throughout the country, and in doing that, I got to know her better. By that time, Victoria had left Boston, returned to Ukraine, and moved from working as a novelist to doing work that she thought was more important at that moment. And that was, at first, she began by documenting women who had given up their sort of professional activities in order to document war crimes. And then she herself became a war crimes documenter,
Ah.
working with an organization called Truth Hounds, which had been founded in 2014, and had been documenting war crimes since the start of the wars. I'm always reminded that the war began really in 2014
Ah.
with a full-scale invasion, not until 2022. And so again, I was privy to a transformation in a person who I had always seen as very kind of soft-spoken, inward, gentle, and not sort of necessarily an activist, to someone who had become, by force of circumstance,
Mm.
an activist, pursuing the kind of work that she thought she was best suited for. And she thought that she was the right person for this job, in part because she was more fluent in English than a lot of the Ukrainian writers that she and others that she
Mm.
was working with. And so she was able to um, communicate what they were seeing more quickly and
Mm.
directly herself. And so when my wife and I were up in on vacation in Vermont when we heard about the missile strike, and that was a shock. There was a missile attack in the city of Kramatorsk, where Victoria had gone with a group of um, Colombian writers and human rights workers who were on a fact-finding mission through Ukraine. They had settled down in a restaurant for dinner when a missile struck the restaurant, and the others at the table around her had all kind of ducked under the table and survived. Victoria, for some reason, did not move either quickly enough, or perhaps
God.
had not felt a need to. I do not know really, what had happened there, why she had not hidden as quickly as everyone else. But I know that while we were teaching together, there would often be air raid sirens in the background, and she and all of our students would ignore them. People had become kind of blasé about those warnings, and so in any
Mm.
case, she was killed in that missile strike, and that loss was a shock to myself and all those who knew her. And we did not want this particular death, which of a war crimes researcher, which who had herself become the victim of a war crime,
Mm.
to go unmarked. And so I very quickly reached out to a number of people I knew who were her friends. And one friend led to another. There were the American writers that I knew and who had met her. And then I was able to get in touch with Hector Abad, the Colombian novelist who was there with
Mm.
her at
Right.
dinner. And he had been very affected by the experience, and had written a piece for the Spanish language journal, which had also been translated and published in the English version of that journal. And then I had read John Lee Anderson's piece in the New Yorker. And I had
Mm.
had some contact with him previously on another project. And everybody I wrote, so a number of friends had published memorials and tributes, and it seemed only to make sense to put them together and try to introduce readers to Victoria and her work now that she could no longer do that herself.
Mm.
There was another kind of painful wrinkle to all this, was that Victoria had just um, found a terrific agent with whom she was working, and I believe the agent, who's located in London, had given her the good news that there was a publisher who was interested in her work, so that things were evolving and unfolding in all the sort of ways that a writer hopes they might. And again, here it was not a matter of a career so much as a mission.
Mm.
So in any case, everybody was very cooperative and willing to let us use their pieces. for no charge, and so it was easy to assemble it. And I have a very cooperative and wonderful team of people I work with at Arrowsmith Press,
Mm.
particular Ezra Fox, who was able to, my senior editor, who was able to put the book together very quickly. While we're a very small publishing house, but we're in the middle of a publishing season that has other sort of projects in the process, so we had to squeeze this in. In any case, we were able to get that done, and then we thought that when you have a book, you have to have a book launch, and we there's a wonderful bookstore in the part of Boston where Victoria had been living called the Brookline Booksmith.
Mm.
Its co-owner, Lisa Gozashti, had already told me that she and her staff had wanted to fundraise to support Ukrainian books and booksellers, another project on which I've been working.
Mm.
And so she thought that the, a nice way to complete the month-long fundraising project was to have an event in honor of Victoria. It turned out, just serendipitously, coincidentally, if there are such things as coincidences in this world, that a number of Victoria's friends and people she had worked with, including the the executive director of Truth Hounds, Roman Avramenko, was going to be in town, as well as the co-winner of the Nobel Peace Prize,
Oh,
um, Alexandra Romantsova. They all happened to be in Boston at that time, so they and American writers who had met Victoria were all able to get together and celebrate her life and her work. So that's sort of the story.
yeah, it was really brilliant that you were able to, do that memorial for her so recently and showcase that work that perhaps wouldn't have been seen. And I actually wanted to ask about the title of the anthology because I spotted an article by Victoria with the same name. Now, is
That's
that
right.
the inspiration then?
Yes, yes. The ironic title is "Nothing Bad Has Ever Happened,"
Mm.
and it's a piece about some of the complex and layered history of her home city of Lviv. But of course, suddenly that title seemed to have a kind of painful application to her own story and Ukraine's story.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've mentioned the importance of, documentarians during this war. And so for you, how do you think writers have played a key role in the Ukraine war?
It's a subject that I think a lot about, and uh, have had many conversations both with American friends and Ukrainian friends about this. And I think that every writer in a situation like this uh, feels in part the truth of those double-edged lines of W.H. Auden that I'm sure that you and others have heard recited many times. Poetry makes nothing happen. It abides in the valley of its saying, where executives would never want to tamper. And yet we somehow know that that's not the case. That literature and art serve a function that is perhaps heightened and more important than ever in times of extremity. In times of personal loss and sorrow, we turn often to poetry, to literature, to art, to reading for some kind of consolation, for some kind of reflection
Mm.
of what it is that we are going through. But I think that, while it's not going to stop your enemy from attacking you, it is going to help you stay human. I
Mm.
think that is one of the most important functions of art, that it reminds us of who we are. It reminds us of that kind of inner world that we have. It reminds us of the power of our imagination to respond to external circumstances. And in engaging with art in times of kind of extreme stress and pain, we create a sort of opening for ourselves, a place in which we can breathe. I like to say about a powerful poem or a powerful work of art that, it's like a tree. It doesn't want to help you. It's just there. But
Mm.
precisely because of its very nature, it is producing oxygen. It helps you breathe.
Mm.
Similarly, I think all great works of art help us breathe a little bit more easily. They give us a moment to inhabit a different space, and yet it is a very important and entirely human space. It is what the whole meaning of culture
Mm.
is kind of contained in a powerful work that allows us to recognize the many dimensions that we always inhabit, even in times of great duress.
Yeah, I mean, it's beautiful that that does exist. And I was at the London Book Fair this year, and there was an installation from broken parts of a library, and it had been painted white to showcase essentially the destruction of literature across the country through airstrikes. So I was really pleased also to see the $15,000 raised for Hub, or helping Ukrainian books and booksellers. So, how do you think these funds help these efforts then?
So this is a project actually that began in part, and Victoria was there at the start of it. My friend Mitchell Kaplan, who runs a series of bookstores in Miami, Florida, here in the
Mm.
U.S., and is the former director of the American Booksellers Association,
Oh.
had asked me to invite a couple of Ukrainian writers to a podcast that he has, a weekly podcast, and I had invited Victoria and Marjana Savka. Marjana Savka is a poet and a performer, a singer, but also the editor in chief and co-owner of U- Ukraine's perhaps largest and most important publishing house, Starý Lev, or
Oh.
translates to mean Old Lion. It is in Lviv. She is also co-owner of a string of bookstores across the country. And so we had a conversation with Mitchell on his podcast, during which Mariana mentioned the consequences of the war for her industry in her world,
Mm.
the world of book publishing and book selling. And she pointed out that a great many of the printing presses and kind of production facilities and warehouses for the entire Ukrainian publishing industry were located largely in the eastern part of the country, and many of them, as you know, Kharkiv is particularly known
Oh
as a
God.
sort of literary center and a center for production. Just in the same way that the U.S. has places, I'm sure the UK does too, particular regions that focus on a particular industry, and so Mitchell, as a committed bookseller, intellectual, and mensch, just sort of could not let this sort of information go by unnoticed, and so he probed a bit about the ways in which the world that he knows so well of booksellers had been affected by it. After this segment was aired in Ukraine, um, I was contacted by the director of the Ukrainian Publishers and Booksellers Association, Oleksandr Afonin, who said that that publishers in the western part of the country were doing relatively well by comparison to those in Kyiv and east
Mm.
of Kyiv, and he gave me some sort of startling statistics about the number of presses that had been damaged, the number of libraries that had been damaged. Uh, he mentioned in passing that some 3,000 professionals who work inside the industry, between booksellers, those who work at printing presses and warehouses, had lost their jobs or had their sort of buildings of places of business
Mm.
destroyed and undermined. And again, 3,000 is a small number when you consider the scale of the war, because at that point, I think there were something like 12 million people who had been displaced from home. But
Right.
here was at least one area in which all of us had some knowledge and engagement and could perhaps do something focused. And so, in my conversations with Mitchell, the idea of fundraising to offer some nominal support
Mm.
and bring some attention to that part of the literary, cultural part of Ukraine that was being decimated by this war, and to help support the individuals on the ground.
Mm.
Alexander has been the head of this organization for a number of years. He is well known and trusted throughout the country. And we, through him, were also in touch with Oksana Zabuzhko, who is the director of the kind of Ukrainian Library Association, the National Association of Libraries. And we decided to see what we could do locally to help support them and our colleagues there. Um, Very quickly, we got involved with Christopher Merrill, who is the director of the University of Iowa's International Writing Program,
Mm.
and that is a worldwide program that brings writers in from crisis regions from all over the world
Wow.
to gather in Iowa City, Iowa, for 3 or 4 months in every fall. So right now he's got 35 writers from all over the world,
Gosh.
from Yemen and from Israel and from Palestine and Ukraine. They're gathering in Iowa, and so Chris is very aware of the complexities of the publishing world internationally. And then also another partner was Jane Unruh, who's the executive director of the Scholars and Artists at Risk program at Harvard, bringing in scholars and writers from all over the world to have a year or so of respite and pursue their professional work at Harvard. We all got together and began to this sort of fundraising effort. And Brookline Booksmith, on their own, had heard about our project and wanted to join in and
Mm.
collaborate and get support from their community. What's most impressive about the fundraising work that they did is that their $15,000 donation is a sum total of 5,000 individual donations, so that
Wow.
the word spread to their donors. And every person who bought a book in the store over the last month was asked if they wanted to support. And so then we Alexander established a process by which there were two stages to it. The first stage was that we wanted to get some money into the hands of those individuals who are most severely affected by the war, and Alexander put out a call to different publishing houses and presses in affected regions, and received countless applications. They were able to select 59 people, I think, who received small grants of we're talking about something like $150 a piece
Mm.
for the first $10,000 that we sent over to Ukraine. And then the second round of support, he decided that perhaps the best most efficient way to really kind of help as wide an audience as possible was to help replenish the stocks of hundreds of libraries,
Mm.
which had either been decimated or had also lost any kind of financial support they might have previously been receiving from their communities or from the state, since, as I understand it, most government funds have now been directed directly
Yeah.
toward the war effort, and things like culture, get just put on the back burner. And yet, you have to keep in mind that even in this, time of siege, kids are going back to school.
Mm.
People are seeking these kind of community centers that libraries have become for
Yeah.
solace and the companionship of each other, but also of books and the kind of comfort that books can provide in this time. Those little sort of repositories of wisdom, these sort of
Mm.
embodiments of our historical longings and aspirations for a better world that the best of literature somehow kind of contains. Alexander and Oksana put out a call to libraries who applied for small grants. And they had enough funds in that second round of support. We were able to send them to fund some 60 libraries. They received about 1,000 applications
Wow.
or 60 grants. And once more, Alexander and his group documented everything, and the information about the individuals who received support as well as the libraries who received support
Wow.
is available on the website of the Ukrainian Publishers and Booksellers Association. And we were satisfied that the project was, the results of the project were transparent enough, and that the money was going where it should be going. And
Mm.
it only inspired us to want to continue to take the next step, which has to do with an auction.
Yeah, I did see that. I was really interested about that because I was going to ask about actually, first of all, in terms of the preservation of these works, like
Yes.
why is it so important to preserve works like this in the middle of a conflict?
I once asked a friend, the Ukrainian writer Oksana Zabuzhko, um, who is one of the country's leading poets and novelists. This was in 2014 when the conflict really began.
Mm.
um, there was an uprising and a protest to against the then president Victor Yanukovych, this kind of corrupt rule and his desire to turn away from Ukraine's sort of accession into the EU. And so there was a large scale protest in the center of Kyiv on what's called the Maidan, which is like the
Mm.
central square in the city. And suddenly hundreds of young people and old people began to kind of gather and say, we would like to join, in fact, join up with Europe, and rather than be returned into the fold of the Russian Empire, that turned into quite a violent scene
Mm.
that lasted for months. And my friend Oksana, who is again a very kind of focused and serious writer, kept going to the front lines there and engaging and risking her life there. And say, I would ask her, why are you doing this? And she said, and then how is it you can kind of go back home and work on an article or work on a story? And and she said that if I don't do both, both become meaningless.
Mm.
If we don't stand up for ourselves and insist on the kind of democracy that we want by going to the front lines, um, then who will we become? Um, eh, what we are defending on the front lines is what I'm doing back in the library, and that is sort of creating a culture and helping a culture to grow. And so that, you know, what we, the question you ask, has so many sort of ways in
Yeah.
which, it's a big question. It is, what is the importance of culture? Who are we without it? Where do we
Mm.
get our sense of identity? We get it through reflecting on our actions, on our histories. Each of them is individual. Each is idiosyncratic, which is why there are so many books in libraries. Which is why there are so many different, forms and styles of art, because there are so many ways in which to express and look at
Mm.
back at ourselves and understand who we are. So that without that sort of the creative expression, um, we are diminished.
Yeah.
We eat and sleep and do our work, but we also have other sides to us. We have an imagination, we have a spirit, and those works of art are the repositories of that spirit and the mirrors and reminders of it. They're also sort of reminders of very particular history. There's a,
Mm.
I just about every country, right, has had those sort of blackout periods in their history. In the U.S., we certainly know the ways in which our racist past, all the sort of sins of the early colonial sort of American history, the destruction of an indigenous population,
Mm.
were elided over and ignored. Certainly throughout my childhood, it was
Yeah.
not a story that I read about in our history books or in novels. And that kind of uncovering of history has been a profound experience, I think, for all cultures worldwide, because we can only understand who we are now by uh, learning something about how we got there,
Mm.
and what we had done, good and bad, in order to get there. And understanding both sides of that is essential for us to fully inhabit our present moment and understand what direction we want to move in from here. So that's why culture is important, and that's why those libraries are essential. They're places where people kind of can become fully human.
Yeah.
Save forms.
Do you know, it's so interesting you've said this because obviously, you know, obviously we're seeing kind of a resurgence of a form of McCarthyism in the
Yes.
US. So it's quite sad that despite us trying to preserve history, that it's almost cyclical, isn't it? That it will eventually disappear again.
And yet, if it eventually disappears, then we know it eventually will resurface, and
Mm.
we're trying to keep the sort of cycle from repeating itself needlessly. There's simply no reason for it to go underground. I understand that there are ugly things in the past, and there are ugly things in probably every people's past, but facing them and moving on is uh, lot healthier, I think, than
Mm.
denying and waiting for the consequences of the sort of repressed stories and the lies to come back at us in a much harsher way. And I think we see that happening in history over and over.
Yeah.
It's the things you turn away from and pretend did never happen that wind up hurting you.
Yeah, definitely. And, speaking of this auction, which is really interesting because obviously, we're talking about sort of almost historical books in a way and to help raise for Hub. So has there been a lot of response? I know the auction is due to take place in November, is that correct?
Yes, although we might be pushing the date back a bit, in part because we have two wonderful partners here, Arthur Fournier, a rare book dealer, uh, a remarkably interesting one who is willing to take on kind of complex tasks that not all booksellers are perhaps ready or eager for, because I know that Arthur will go into um, troubled places around the world, including war zones, in order
Well,
to help preserve important libraries. And Avi Kovacevic at catalog sales, an auction house online, have combined forces in order to further support and fundraise on behalf of Ukrainian books and booksellers by gathering items of historical uh, interest and to rare book collectors. And so we're still in the process of gathering original manuscripts and signed books and first editions of key and important works of literature and art. And we're Arthur is still kind of gathering donations for that. I'm not sure what exactly on what date the auction will launch, but I think it'll probably be a little bit later in November, in
mm,
part because the realities of everybody's lives and work have wound up the process taking a little bit longer than we had anticipated. But we hope to be able to announce a date in a couple of weeks.
oh, fantastic. Yeah, it's brilliant. That is so that's so lovely. I quite like that idea as well. That there's a purpose, a meaning to
That's right.
it. And obviously, as you said, it is a very meta kind of situation with the books essentially giving life again and getting
That's right.
life again. And I think that's a
That's
great
right.
thing. You've
Yeah,
mentioned, exactly. Otherwise, it would just be on someone's shelf,
that's right.
and it's so. Where is it going to go? Are people just going to buy these books and then the money will then go to those funds?
Yes. Again, the money will be transferred via the Coral Gables Foundation to the organization in Ukraine, the Ukrainian Publishers Association, and I'm happy to provide a link to their website so people can follow and track this story as it unfolds. And that's yeah. And again, we believe that the directors of this organization in Ukraine will know the best way to make use of these funds. And we have come to trust them in our work together over the last year. And so we simply leave all the decisions about the disbursement of funds to them and hope that after the war is over, we'll all be able to find out, to see each other in person and to find out a little bit more about the restoration of the culture and the work that these books have done.
God, that would be amazing. It's such a strange feeling because exactly. I do remember Victor Yanukovych's Golden Palace.
Oh, yes. I've not been there,
Um,
but have you been there?
no, no, but I just remember
Yeah,
reporting
yeah.
on it, and
Yeah,
the images were staggering, weren't they? Just as they were coming out, and I do wonder, did any of that old history, like those books, were they preserved at from that time too, from 2014?
Well, again, I don't think that there was anything comparable to the sort of destruction
Hmm.
that is taking place now. I mean, the yes, I mean, given that the war then began shortly after Yanukovych was deposed, and it began in the east and around the fighting around Kharkiv and Donetsk had goes back all the way to then. But I don't think that again there was anything like the damage that was done. So I don't believe that. At least I do not know the fate of any of the work that was damaged at that time. So I can't answer that.
No, that's interesting, but well, hopefully they were able to preserve as much as they could if there was anything like that. But Askold, thank you so much for speaking with me, and thank you also for providing the link to so that other people can follow what's going on with it. It's really vital. And as you say, hopefully at the end of this, we can go visit and basically help rebuild this important cultural hub, which is Ukraine. It's just I actually still can't believe what's happened there, but yes, it's horrific.
I'm with you. It also, because it was so unnecessary, as I suppose every war is, so unnecessary. I thank you so very much for your attention to this and for your support in this project, and also to all of your listeners who may be interested in supporting and donating to it. I will provide a link or an email, so that if anybody has a really kind of interesting item, that they would be willing to share, and perhaps discover the fate of its uh, reincarnation as a library somewhere in Ukraine. I, I look forward to continuing to track what happens from here. But again, your time and your engagement are deeply appreciated. Thank you so very much.